All right, Dr. Fetzer, let's get going.
Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Why the Warren Commission may be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American public. Now your host, Len Osanek.
The Kennedy assassination was documented by several amateur films and still photographs. Enough to allow important information, such as the shot sequence, aid the investigation. But the Warren Commission never commissioned a detailed forensic analysis of the photographic evidence. The analysis, which was done by the CIA's Photographic Interpretation Lab, was not shared with the Commission. Only years later was proper investigative work done with the photographic evidence. Researcher Pat Spear uncovers the work of the House Select Committee's photographic panel.
This is Pat Spear. One of the most persistent myths regarding the Kennedy assassination is that the Zapruder film shows evidence for but one shooter firing from behind. This myth is built upon the premise President Kennedy and Governor John Connally are hit at the same time, just as they come out from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign in the film. But those pushing this scenario in print and on TV inevitably fail to reveal a most inconvenient truth. The last government body to study the case, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, convened a panel of photographic experts in 1978 to study the film. This panel, headed by Calvin S. McCamey, former chairman of the American Society of Photogrammetry, concluded Kennedy was hit before he went behind the sign of the film. At approximately Zapruder frame 200, Kennedy's movements suddenly freeze. His right hand abruptly stops in the midst of a waving motion, and his head moves rapidly from right to his left in the direction of his wife. Based on these movements, it appears that by the time the president goes behind the sign at frame 207, he is evidencing some kind of reaction to a severe external stimulus. By a vote of 12-5, the panel determined that President Kennedy first showed a reaction to some severe external stimulus by Zapruder frame 207, as he is seen going behind a sign that obstructed Zapruder's view. By a vote of 11-3, the panel determined that Governor Connally first showed a reaction to some severe external stimulus by Zapruder frame 224, virtually immediately after he is seen emerging from behind a sign that obstructed Zapruder's view. So yes, it's true. The only panel of photographic experts to ever study the Zapruder film concluded Kennedy and Connally reacted about a second apart. Now, this is a big problem for those claiming Oswald acted alone. The FBI had established back in 1963 that the fastest one could fire Oswald's rifle with any accuracy was once every 2.3 seconds. If both reactions observed by the HSCA's panel were correct, well, then there had to be another shooter. Kennedy's close aide, Kenneth O'Donnell, writing next to Powers, testified, "I noticed the slump. He'd been waving out the right side of the car, and I noticed him slump over towards Mrs. Kennedy." Motorcycle officer James Chaney, riding at the Kennedy's right rear, also said, "We heard the first shot. I thought it was a motorcycle backfiring, and I looked back over my left, and also President Kennedy looked back over his left shoulder." Mrs. Kennedy's movements are equally suggestive. Just ask Phil Willis. Willis testified that he took this picture as a reaction to the first of 3 shots. It has since been proven that this photo was taken around frame 202 of the Zapruder film, more than a second before those claiming Oswald acted alone now claim Kennedy was first hit. Willis testified, "The president was smiling and waving and looking straight ahead, and Mrs. Kennedy was likewise smiling and facing more to my side of the street. When the first shot was fired, her head seemed to just snap in that direction, and he more or less faced the other side of the street and slumped forward. Is it just a coincidence that the computer simulations shown on television and purporting to prove Kennedy was first hit around frame 224, at the same time as Connally, invariably fail to show the movements of Mrs. Kennedy leading up to that time? The film shows Kennedy and Connally react at different times and suggests they were hit by separate shots at frames too close together to have been fired by a lone gunman using Oswald's rifle."
The eyewitness consensus has Mrs. Kennedy turning towards her husband in response to the first shot. In the Zapruder film, Mrs. Kennedy is clearly and undeniably facing her husband as the limousine comes out from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. Governor John Connally, as close as a witness as possible, consistently maintained until his death that he was hit by a second shot and the first shot struck President Kennedy before him.
Well, this one's very interesting. I mean, the bottom line is correct, namely that there's evidence here in the video record that Connally was hit at least a full second after JFK had been hit, but there are several problems with the analysis or reasons supporting it, even though he has the correct conclusion. For example, he maintains that the Mannlicher Carcano could have the bolt action operated and aimed within 2.3 seconds, but that's actually the bare bones time required just to work the manual bolt action. So he's mistaken on that count. When he talks about the first shot, and many, he quotes here Dave Powers, for example, talking about the first shot. For Powers, that's the first shot he perceived, or what he heard to be the first shot, which sounded like a firecracker. The fact is, however, that the medical, ballistic, and other evidence supports that it was at least the second hit, not shot, but the second hit on JFK that created the sound of the firecracker, which was the bullet passing through the windshield en route to his throat. So when they talk about JFK, moving his hands up to his throat, that's in relation to the second hit on JFK for the first was fired from the top of the county records building by the deputy chef, Harry Weatherford, which hit JFK in the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column, which I have discussed before and document extensively in Reasoning About Assassinations, which you can find online, which I presented at Cambridge and then published in an international peer-reviewed journal. So we have the interesting phenomenon, by the way, that at about 4 minutes and 16 seconds into this, you can actually see the hole in the windshield very clearly, right about where JFK's left ear would be if JFK's left ear were visible. Jim Lewis, a researcher, has been going through junkyards in the South and has fired through the windshield of junk cars to see if he could hit dummies positioned in the back. And not only has he been able to do that, but he established that when the bullet passes the windshield, it creates a small white spiral nebula, such as you can see in that image about 4 minutes and 16 seconds in, and makes the sound of a firecracker. So, as many times as I have discussed this, including in the great Zapruder film hoax, for example, I am troubled that some, like Pat Spear, have not quite caught up to what we know about the shooting sequence, but that nevertheless the bottom line is claim that Connally is hit by a separate shot than what hit JFK is undoubtedly true.
I'm Len Osanek, the host of Black Op Radio. Along with President Kennedy and Governor Connally, a third person was wounded in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963.
The presidential motorcade corner, I heard these three loud noises.
Show me where you were standing when you heard the shots.
I was standing at the east end of the triple underpass.
Did you indicate where the bullet struck the concrete curb?
The bullet struck the curb on the south curb of Main Street. It was a deputy sheriff, Buddy Walters. Says, I felt something sting me on the face. Looked at me, says, yes, says, you got blood on your cheek. He says, where were you standing? I says, well, down by the underpass. And Walters got about 10 feet away. He says, look there on the curb, there was a very visible mark on the curb where a bullet had struck. Either a fragment of the bullet or a piece of the concrete. It flew up and scratched my face.
The FBI, who officially took over the investigation a few days after the assassination, was not interested in this event. Tague was not interviewed until the 14th of December, a week after the FBI's primary investigative report had been filed. In that report, the FBI established a shooting sequence of 2 shots striking President Kennedy and 1 shot striking Governor Connally. They did not account for an apparent missed or wild shot. The Warren Commission also ignored James Tague for months. In June 1964, he contacted a Dallas Times Herald reporter, and the resulting story was picked up nationally. Due to this publicity, the Warren Commission finally listed Tague as a witness requiring an interview. James Tague was deposed in late July 1964. In August, the FBI submitted the curbstone to a lab analysis after acknowledging the curb had been patched, presumably by the city of Dallas. The FBI would describe the bullet smear showing remnants of lead with a trace of antimony, but no trace of copper, as would be expected from the copper-jacketed bullets allegedly used by Lee Oswald. The Tague shot created a host of problems for the Warren Commission's version of events, since they were committed to a scenario that allowed for only 3 shots. One missed or wild shot meant the single bullet theory had to be fully embraced, which has been a source of doubt in the Warren Commission's finding ever since. In the end, the Warren Commission could offer no account for the Tague shot other than to acknowledge it happened. Any explanation only served to undermine their predetermined scenario. Accordingly, we are left with the sharpshooting assassin who scored 2 direct hits on a moving target, but also firing a shot which not only missed the vehicle, it missed the street completely. It is just unbelievable.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, the story of James Tague and the elusive concrete curb.
Well, Gary, it's correct that the Secret Service and the FBI, even the day of the assassination, concluded there had been 3 shots with 3 hits. That JFK had been hit in the back, actually 5.5 inches below the collar of the right of the spinal column, which was, in fact, an accurate report. That Connolly had been shot in the back, and then JFK had been hit in the back of the head, killing him. The fact that James Tague had been injured by a shot that missed was an extremely inconvenient circumstance, which they wanted to obfuscate, and it's quite remarkable that until this story got out, Tague had not been called as a witness, and that did not occur until July of 1964, which required them to reconstruct their analysis of the shooting sequence and now account for all the wounds using only 2 bullets rather than 3, which led to the introduction of the imaginative magic bullet theory, which Gerald Ford, as a junior member of the commission, facilitated by having the description of the wound to the back change from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck, which was blatantly false. David W. Mandick has established on the basis of a PET scan of a patient with similar neck and chest dimensions as the magic bullet theory isn't even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. At about 3 minutes and 25 seconds into this particular segment, you can see Arlen Specter holding a pointer to illustrate the trajectory the bullet would have had to have taken were the magic bullet theory true. And below his hand, although it's oddly obfuscated in this photograph, there's a large patch on the back of the stand-in for JFK that represents the location of the wound to the back, which means that a photograph that's intended to illustrate the magic bullet theory actually refutes it. Richard Sprague in Computers and Automation, May 1970, shows that the trajectory from the Dow Tech to the location where Sprague was standing was a straight trajectory from a shot that apparently just barely missed JFK. But if, as I surmise, it was fired using a Mannlicher Carcano, that's really not all that surprising. Though it is interesting that, as Leno Sanik reports, copper appears to have been missing from the analysis if we can take it for granted. In any case, the Sprague report was historically extraordinarily important because it led to the revision of the official account, where, to the best of my knowledge, neither the FBI nor the Secret Service has ever revised their original 3-shot, 3-hit scenario, and led to the introduction of the fantasy magic bullet scenario.
In tonight's episode, we discuss photographic evidence the Warren Commission didn't want you to see, movie film, and still photography. The aftermath of the assassination in Dealey Plaza. Expert Robert Groden discusses his observations.
This is Robert Groden from Dallas, Texas. One of the things I wanted to discuss is filmed evidence that happened right after the assassination. We have several films taken by CBS TV, NBC TV, standard 8mm cameras in Dealey Plaza from bystanders that show the reactions of the crowds after the assassination. Now, clearly, a lot of the people are standing around doing nothing after the shots are fired initially because they weren't aware the shots had been fired. We have a whole bunch of motorcycles backfiring. We have hundreds of people applauding, clapping, what have you. And a lot of people actually misunderstood what they were hearing. But those who were aware of what happened and those who did respond ran toward the grassy knoll. In many films, the Bell film, the Hughes film, the Nix film, in many of them, we see witnesses paying attention to the knoll. No one is paying attention to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository except for one man. That's Officer Marion Baker. He is the only one who ran toward the depository, not because he thought shots were fired from there, but since he saw the pigeons on the roof fly away, he thought that something might have gone on up there, and he also wanted to get a better view of the plaza from up above, so he ran toward the depository. And that's where the witnesses said the shots came from. That's where an NBC News photographer, David Wigman, actually filmed the smoke coming from behind the stockade fence. Anybody who feels that no shots came from the grassy knoll clearly does not know the evidence. If there was a shot from the grassy knoll, even one shot, and there was evidence of much more than one shot from the knoll, but even if there was just one, that means a second shooter and therefore a conspiracy.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, I'm holding my breath on the next one with Robert Groden. Go ahead. What do you think? Did he do at least a good job on this one?
Well, basically, with one notable exception, what Groden has to say here is very reasonable. Now, that Officer Baker was rushing into the book depository is, of course, rather surprising given how many others are going in the opposite direction. We have, of course, the very well-known confrontation between him and Lee Oswald in the lunchroom there, where he holds him in his sights until Roy Truly comes over and assures him the man is an employee who belongs there. He wrote in his original report that Oswald was drinking a Coke. And Roy Truly added in his handwritten statement, where both can be found in the published in the Warren Commission report, the 888-page summary volume, that he seemed, perfectly normal, relaxed, not perspiring, not agitated, and where, this is completely inconsistent with the idea of a lone gunman having just assassinated the President of the United States, rushed down 4 flights of stairs into the lunchroom and for what, to have a Coke? I mean, it's really a preposterous scenario, and yet that's what the government would have us believe. What I find more interesting, striking, is in the first opening passages where he shows us a clip from the Nix film, you actually see Clint Hill rush up and get on the back of the Nix. And what Groden doesn't point out is that Jackie is further back on the trunk and Clint is moving further forward than you see in the Zapruder, which means that this very clip of film from the Nix that Robert Groden presents shows that the Zapruder film has to have been altered, or the Nix has to have been altered, because they are inconsistent. I actually published an article about this entitled "Nix Film Contradicts Zapruder, More Film of JFK Film Fakery," so that, in my opinion, it's rather embarrassing to have a man who is touted as such an expert on films and photographs show a clip of the Nix film that contradicts the Zapruder, and yet he maintains they're completely consistent and unaltered when they're not even consistent when you compare the two of them in the specific respect, as I've explained in that article. Nix film contradicts Zapruder.
All right, looks like that's a wrap on episode 14. That was Robert Groden covering the films available to us in the aftermath in Dealey Plaza. All right, next up, Dr. Fetzer, let's go ahead and polish off the segment with Victoria Adams, who 11/22/63 was just a girl on the stairs. This is author Barry Ernest.
In this episode, we expose the fraud of the Warren Commission by omission. According to the Warren Commission, Lee Oswald fired 3 shots at the motorcade, scurried from his sniper's nest to hide his rifle between stacks of book cartons, then dashed down 4 flights of stairs to the 2nd floor lunchroom, where he was confronted by Dallas police officer Marion Baker some 75 seconds after the shots rang out. But there was a problem. 2 employees of the small publishing firm located on the 4th floor of the school book depository were also on the staircase soon after the shots, and neither of them saw or heard Oswald. How did the Warren Commission handle this discrepancy? Author Barry Ernest tells the story of The Girl on the Stairs.
I'm Barry Ernest, author of The Girl on the Stairs. It's the story of a neglected witness by the name of Victoria Adams, who posed a serious threat to the Warren Commission's fundamental thesis of how Lee Oswald escaped from the 6th floor in the aftermath of the shooting. Miss Adams witnessed the assassination while standing behind a 4th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Immediately after the final shot, she and a co-worker descended the depository's back stairs to the ground floor. Their innocent attempt to determine what was happening outside turned into a critical problem for the developing official account. For if Miss Adams was accurate with her timing, she was on the staircase at the exact same moment the commission said Oswald was there as he made his getaway from the sniper's nest. Yet neither Miss Adams nor her accompanying co-worker saw or heard anyone. In a February 1964 internal memo, Warren Commission staff lawyer David Bellin identified Miss Adams as an important witness, and he wrote that he intended to resolve the timing issue of exactly when she was on the stairs. On the contrary, no attempt was made to verify or even further examine her information. Before a stenographer was brought in to transcribe Miss Adams' official testimony, David Bellin told her he didn't believe a word of what she was saying. Taken aback by the comment, Miss Adams then asked that Sandra Stiles, the co-worker who accompanied her down the stairs, be questioned. The request was refused. Instead, the Warren report would imply that Miss Adams had made the descent alone. When Miss Adams next sought to be included in any of the numerous time tests regarding Oswald's escape from the building, the request was refused. In fact, Miss Adams was the only person excluded from those time tests. In lieu of searching for the truth, Commission lawyers chose to cast aspersions on her honesty by fostering a scenario that placed her on the staircase much later than when she said, inflating that time to some 5 minutes after the shooting. In lieu of evidence proving Miss Adams was correct, the Commission chose to use against her words she has vehemently denied making. The Warren Commission may have made an honest mistake in their handling of Victoria Adams, was clearly shown otherwise by the discovery of a Justice Department letter written in June 1964. The letter spoke of an interview with Miss Adams' work supervisor, who confirmed that Miss Adams and her co-worker, Sandra Stiles, were in fact on the staircase during the time Oswald was to have been there. That memo should have provoked immediate and searching inquiry. Instead, it was suppressed for 35 years.
Victoria Adams' corroborated eyewitness account simply demolishes the Warren Commission's conclusions regarding Lee Oswald's presence on the 6th floor at the time of the shooting.
All right, Jim, take us to the break with Vicki Adams. What do you think of Barry Ernest's work here?
I think Barry Ernest has done a wonderful job with this. I think it's fascinating, and it conclusively shows that the official account is a fabrication. They aren't going to call her as a witness because they know what she's saying is true and what they're claiming is false. David Bellin was an evil presence. I mean, if there's a despicable character in this entire cast, it's David Bellin, who's been extremely vicious and nasty to truth tellers and very supportive of those who are willing to bend the truth to support the Commission's fantastic scenario. One of the fascinating aspects of this, Gary, which you discerned and pointed out to me, is that around 3:15 to 3:20, you see that these stairways actually lead into rooms, so there's not a single continuous stairway up and down those various flights, but would require transiting through rooms, which makes it all the more conspicuous that somebody coming down the stairway would have been observed. And, the fact that Victoria Adams had a co-worker with her is all the more convincing. Frankly, there is more powerful and direct evidence that Lee Oswald was not on the stairway, which derives from the Alton 6 photograph, where he unknowingly captured Lee in the doorway, which we've been able to establish on the basis of the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the T-shirt the figure is wearing, where it's a very distinctive, richly textured shirt. He's of slight build. He's about 5'10", Billy Lovelady explained that he thought it was very curious people would confuse him because he was 3 inches shorter and 15 to 20 pounds heavier. Billy appears to be in the doorway area to the right of the doorman as we look at the film with his hands upraised to protect his eyes from the film. He's wearing a short-sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt, which he showed to the FBI when he went in for an interview at their request on 29 February 1964. They photographed him and reported that he had stated this was the shirt he was wearing, which blows the whole Lovelady doorman identification completely out the window. But figures like Robert Groden, Robin Unger, a host of others have ignored the evidence. There's a figure they claim who's further down in the front area who is wearing a red and black checkered shirt, but it's buttoned right up to the collar, obviously not the doorman whose shirt is splayed open, and he must outweigh doorman by 35 pounds at least. His face, by the way, in profile looks nothing like Billy Lovelady, so the claim that this is Billy Lovelady is simply absurd. But that's the depth to which those who are trying to obfuscate the truth from the American people have sunk. And I include, therefore, Robert Groden, who actually took photographs later of Billy Lovelady wearing a red and black checkered shirt, which has been itself subjected to alteration. I'm sorry to say that Robert Groden has played a very important role here in concealing the truth from the American people, and I would suggest those who want further substantiation of what I'm observing should go to the article entitled JFK, Believe It or Not, Oswald Wasn't Even a Shooter, and also review the JFK War, the challenging case of Robert Groden.